I remember the first time I was here at Nationalmuseum, and Leonardo made me aware of Bellini, and he was talking about how it appears that the painting has been damaged or not treated too well, and that has accidentally given it that technica, macchia idea, that whole vibration of the surface, and that is something that allows things to melt together, so that you get that more Greek conception of form. But of course, it doesn't help if you don't have a good idea of form in the beginning. So you can see what Bellini is doing here with the legs, and dissolving the forms down to the bottom of the painting. We don't look there. And then how things just dissolve into each other. So when he has that clear form from beforehand, the fact that the painting has been not treated so well doesn't destroy it. It's kind of like what you can see with these frescoes in Naples, at the museum there, from Pompeii. They've been quite damaged, and one of them really looks like the sick child of Edvard Munch in the how things vibrate against each other. And you see the same effect here. And of course you see that counterline, how important it is. I come to think of it now, when I look at the way the hair is painted to the right of the face, I would not be surprised if that was the ground. It could very well be. And so you see that you can get the same kind of variation between passiveness and more active areas, and a quite great variety in how you paint, even though you don't paint exactly in this very structured, crispy way that Rembrandt does. You see it here. This is a really clear example of unifying those two principles of the line and just the vibration of these two surfaces meeting each other. You see, it could have been clearer when it was made, but now the way it appears, you have that cooler vibrancy of the shadow against the warmer vibrancy of the light. And of course you have to have that warmth still in the cooler shadows. And the funny thing also is that this is something that Leonardo mentioned, that maybe Lars Hartevig, the landscape painter, was inspired by the way the landscape is painted. He's made all of these individual straws and still manages to keep them as a part of the totality, which is also what Hartevig is doing, because he knows the form so well that he can pull it off. And I don't know if this appears to be that he's moved the body or that he's painted it, repainted it, done some changes to it. You see there's a dark line going down there. So maybe he was more to the right, or he found that it was too skinny and had to give him some more kilos. God. There's, despite the clear differences in how it's painted, there's also so many similarities. The eyes of Simon with the Christ child by Rembrandt, you see that the eye to the right is almost completely flat, really toned down, and the eye to the left, you have that same idea of almost in geometric form in the light of the actual eyelid that really makes it pop out. So you don't have, and this is Nerdim has talked about the same thing, you don't have two similar eyes or equally important eyes. You need to focus on one of them to get full power in the image. And you see, so these things that we're looking at is not a specific painter's style. It is criteria that help things become more credible, more realistic, not in the French realism style meaning of the word, but credible. You have the coolness here of the shadow and the warmth of the body. And I don't know if it was very much clearer delineated when it was newly painted, but you see how that gives such a vibrancy to it, gives such a painterliness to it. And so that's a really, really important thing to understand. No matter how this was originally made, if you're going to work with an image that has that technica, macchia idea, that dissolving the forms, you have to have some very clear lines. Unless it all just disintegrates. Yeah, you can have this as an icon for how you should paint, but don't only see the mess of it, but see the structure of it as well. So this is a real nice icon to have when you want to make your masterpiece. Remember to dissolve the form, but don't forget the clear lines. Georges Latour is an old darling of mine. I remember we went in 1997. I just started as a student, and we took the plane to Paris to see a big exhibition of his. Back and forth in 14 hours. That was nice. I think this is not a very early painting, but it's also not a very late painting where he goes even darker and is famous for these candlelit scenes. But I think if it's one thing that you really can learn, several things from Georges Latour, it's contour line. You see, in some way, it shouldn't be a favorite painter of mine because it's really quite clear in the contrast. And when you look at Rembrandt, that's very, very different, right? But you see how when he follows the arm, it's his sense of proportion and his sense of rhythm and the exactness with which he hits the form is so great that it doesn't become a problem. I mean, yes, he is stiffer than he became later, but this is really something you should learn before you start trying anything like late Rembrandt. Look at this here, for example, just the acute sense of where the line changes direction. You see it all over, but at the same time also being able to dissolve, because that's what it's doing here. Look at how the shadow and the shoulder there more or less melts into the background. There you have just a cool warm contrast between background and the biceps there, upper arm. It's also quite strange because it's so strong in that red color, and you can say yes, it is somewhat too separate. It's somewhat too distinct. But if he had done the same thing and not being able to understand the contour line, it wouldn't have worked at all. Look at that. You see, here he, at the same time, has a really clear, defined line of the cloth. But because the values of the skin and the cloth are so close to each other, he can still have a smooth transition so that the hand is not cut out from the rest of the body. This is a beauty too. You see how we can approximate the same idea that Rembrandt is working with, this idea of the whole form, the contour line around the form as the most important thing, and he still pulls off to almost draw with a brush and indicate these fingers, but of course he can do that because everything is basically just melting together, and he's sort of putting in these strokes in the same way as Rembrandt basically, but it's just doing it more in a drawing-like manner. He's almost drawing, but he's doing it in a painterly way, like that nail here with the dirt underneath, probably maybe blood because he's whipping himself. And it's so clear, but he understands also that he needs to let things melt together, so he doesn't over-explain the forms. And it's interesting, you see also this is something I encounter all the time, that challenge. When you paint someone with light skin, you have to get that grainness into the color, into the skin. Because if you don't, it doesn't look credible. Yeah. So despite appearances, there are absolutely some similarities and connections with Rembrandt. And you see that with the beard melting into the shadow, shadow melting into the background, but then actually he draws some hairs, and he can only pull that off because he has such an acute sense of the rhythm and the forms. And it's very sparingly with the contrast, like in the face, just in the temple there, a little bit up on the forehead, up on the skull. And then again, this hair just dissolves into the background. So understanding these things is really key if you ever would like to try the Rembrandt method. Yes, this is 1651, and Rembrandt is already then approaching this way of painting. You see how this comes more and more with that rough manner of painting. It's like it's a necessary partner. This thing about graying down the whole arm there. And that allows him also to make it slowly just slide into the background. Just pushes these things out in the peripheral vision. There's the same thing with that shoulder there. Sort of neutralizes it, pacifies it. And it's quite strange. I mean, this is not on the level of the Simon in the Temple, but you see it's working with the same things. And the shadow here is surprisingly passive, almost a bit too much. But you see the effect of it in any case. You see the effect of it is the extreme attention on the face. You see the same phenomenon happening on that elbow here. It's almost the same colors in the background, but we buy it as a part of the elbow because he has that stroke going up. But it's all almost completely dissolved. And then you see those few strokes around the fingers create that idea of spatial depth. And Rembrandt wouldn't be Rembrandt if he didn't really build up the matter. It's also something you can really learn from him. Don't just copy the color, create actual matter. You know, this is based on Leonardo's Last Supper. Of course, it's not set him up exactly the way that Leonardo was doing it, but you see he works with pairs of 3 figures. And this key figure here being the third person of 2 of these groups. That's quite advanced. And all the attention is drawn to the swords. So you see that the activity of these, or the body language of these figures here are quite calmed down, so they will not compete with the main element, which is the swearing of the oath of the Batavians. And this was commissioned for the town hall in Amsterdam, because Holland was fighting to get free from the Spanish, and Claudius Civilis was someone who in his time had fought against the Romans to be liberated. And this is where they take the oath that they shall fight against the Romans. You know, it's once you know how to place things, once you know proportions, all of these things, everything is about, or a lot is about getting the attention, getting the drama, focusing our attention to the important thing, and you see that in of course, the swords, and everyone is directed at that, and there's very little activity, comparably little activity on the right side of the painting. And I don't know if you know this, but this was actually much larger. It was 5.5 by 5.5 meters, so double, triple, or whatever. And it was going to hang in the town hall in Amsterdam. But then apparently, mostly because he painted Claudius Civilis as too honest, as you would say, it was rejected, and so we cut it down. And then you have those anecdotes about Rembrandt in the last part of his life, telling people to step away from the paintings, not go in and study them, but step away so that you get the right impression of it. And that's also a fascinating thing that say about Rembrandt. He traveled very little, but of course he didn't have to, because the world came to Amsterdam. And then we get to the painting technique here, because he had a bunch of prints of all kinds of known masters, including Leonardo. But he could also see some Titians in different collections in Amsterdam, more of the Titian's early work, but then it seems very probable that he saw the Flaying of Martials by Titian, maybe in 1654, 55, something like that. And that, I think, was a major turning point. Also reading Pliny about this very rough manner of painting that Apelles engaged in at the end. And that's something so fascinating. Something I learned from Nerdrum. Aristotle talks about in the Rhetoric, I guess it is, talking about how the difference between giving a lecture and giving a speech. A speech, you use the broad terms, you're not using footnotes. And then he compares that with making a sketch. And that idea has influenced Titian, and then through Titian has influenced Rembrandt. Now, of course, he knows this is going to be viewed from afar because it was supposed to hang high up and all of this. So you see, like in that figure, third from the right, very clear, this very grand brushstrokes, grand planes. He's not concerned with details at all. And you see what happens when he bumps into the back of the standing man. Now, this is something you shouldn't do. You have one line, the nose meeting the other line coming down there. But of course, what Rembrandt does is to neutralize the back totally, so there's no crash between them. And oh, this is one of the most fantastic things. Look at number 2 here. We'll call him number 2. If you go up his face and look at the strokes just above the eye to the left, some very clear strokes that way. And you would think, well, why would you paint that part of the forehead with strokes going that way? But that shows the vibrancy of the light hitting the skin, along with, I mean, he's not an old man, but he has some structure in the skin, right? But then the most fantastic thing is when you come up and you look at his hair, the back of the head, it's almost nothing. Of course, he's painted something there, but it's almost just a background sealing off a shape of a head, and he's almost not painted the hair at all. So this is really a painting technique for very skilled and lazy people. You see the enormous sense of volume, like on the top of the shoulder here, little thing sticking up there, almost melting together with the background, yet we still see it very clearly, and just pacifying it so that the shoulder and these other things really come out. And look at just under his chin, to the right and left of the chin, indicating the collar, or top of the jacket there. 2, 3 light strokes, and that brings it out. And the way it was actually was the tablecloth went here. So you would see the full figure of Claudius Civilis. And then he added that on when he cut it down. And also what you see when you really study Rembrandt in real life is that he's very un-Baroque. He doesn't have these really strong colors, and he did have a little bit more as a younger painter, but not really too much then either. Compared to Titian, absolutely not. Titian was very strong in the color as a young painter. So Rembrandt sort of had this trajectory all along, and he was trying to get this type of painting at least a decade earlier. he was very well aware of this, the technica macchia that Apelles was famed for. And so there are several things. The cliché about Rembrandt, cliché about, of course, Baroque painting is it's all brown. And you look at it in real life and you see that it's gray and green. There's no, of course there's brown colors, that's obvious, but I mean and even the brown colors, even the red colors, he tones down. I think this is something that Nordrum mentioned, this thing about having your colors. You start from the gray and you go towards red or towards yellow or towards whatever color you need. And you see also on that hand there, the man to the very left, then you learn something that is next stage when it comes to creating volume. Because one thing is, of course, the Baroque, chiaroscuro, light and dark, strong contrast, and obviously there are contrasts here. But on that hand, you see there's that infamous cool, warm contrast. Not that they're exactly the same value, but quite close. I think it's it's with Rembrandt as it is with early Munch. You don't go here to study how to paint hands, you know. There's so much wrong, you could say, anatomically and all these things, but okay, he manages to get this wonderful atmosphere so that you don't really even think about it. Look at how, and that's another thing. If you really look at the body of Claudius Civilis, absolutely there's a lot of things going on, but look at the chain he's wearing. If you think about your typical Rembrandt portrait of the 1640s or 30s, the chain is there all in all details. And of course he knows now that there's something greater at stake, and that is the mood, the whole drama of the painting. So, okay, so he tones that down. And look in that little house that is created there under the swords. And you see how flat he makes things so that they recede, they don't compete with the most important things. Like the hands here. All those hands are quite monochrome. There's variation in the shadow and light, obviously, but they're quite flat. They're not built. And you look at the hands and the hand of Claudius Civilis. So what is happening? Is it coming out of his belly? He just hides it, neutralizes it. It cannot take attention. That's how you have to think. But you have to know what to do before you do it, obviously. There's, and they were very well aware of this. There was even society at the time, the Apelles Society, wasn't that the name? And Govert Flink was like honorary member. He was very slick. And that's when Rembrandt painted the bust with Aristotle with bust of Homer. And Simon Schama makes a nice point about how Rembrandt with that painting is saying, well, I am the one who's painting like Apelles, because Apelles was known for this rough way of painting. And this is also something that obviously influenced Rembrandt about toning down the palette even more, that infamous or famous limited palette with 4 colors. So this idea of resisting the need to explain everything. The way the hair of the older man, it's like a priest figure almost, meets the skin. Big atmospheric strokes just meeting each other. I think that's a fundamental thing to understand. And you see it also under the jawline there, and especially the ear. No kind of details. There's an indication of a pearl there, right? But absolutely not elaborated more than that. It's the same idea as this thing about that the Rembrandt is so skilled at how things appear in the side vision. If you want, when you're painting this figure, when he's painting this figure, he is thinking about how does that appear when I'm looking at Claudius Civilis. Always come back to that. And you see generally how flat the forms are that he works with. But they're full of vibrancy, right? So he's hiding them in plain sight. And I think this may be, on the right side there, a reminiscence from when it was bigger, some hands or something, because there was more figures on the side, and some great space around, they're sitting on a plateau. And then he added that figure there also, when he redid it. To be able to do these things. I talk about that a lot, but I think it's really important to repeat it. You see all the time you can go from one form effortlessly over into the other, even though there's a shoulder line going down there. You can travel effortlessly from one thing to the other. And then look at the top there, it's like a cape or something like that over his shoulder. And the way that just melts together with the background. And there's so many things, so many times you can do that. You want to get this in focus, well, you just tone down the shoulder there on the left side of his face. So the cliche about how you paint different surfaces is that if you have something that is very smooth, you use smooth strokes. If you have something rough, you rough it up. And of course, along comes Rembrandt and completely disproves that idea. Here's this beautiful glass, and it's really built up in the lights. My God. And then you see that paint can suddenly reflect the vibrancy of the light or the atmosphere, and not just the matter that it's supposed to represent. It's like you can see with young Edvard Munch also, paints a beautiful little girl. Okay, smooth skin. Well, how does it paint it? Well, something like this, very rough. I also remember when I was a student of Nerdrum, he was talking about something, and that's the centrality of this painting, that this was the revelation for the young Odd Nerdrum when he came in here as an 18-year-old Art Academy student and was mind blown by this painting. And Nerdrum talked about, when I was a student, about these sort of black holes, or like you see around the face or around the head. Oh, Claudius Civilis there. Between the beard and the hair on Civilis, under his beard, to the right of his head, and also on the priest, the druid priest here, where the skin meets the hood and on across the hood, and over his forehead also. And if you would take that into a like Photoshop program, and you take away those dark areas, you would see that the shapes, the volumes flatten out in the wrong way. So they are essential. When you're working with quite flat forms, as Rembrandt is doing, flat but vibrant forms, so they don't take attention, then you need those lines to secure the form and enhance the form in some places. Seated next to that young man there, certain sort of black holes or black lines that really sink in. And that's another thing that I've really discovered or become more aware of the later years. The necessity of the contour line, and you see it very clearly in that figure. If you can nail the contour line, you can defend having a fairly flat form, but still give it volume and make it credible. And there's a little fun fact here. It's almost like you don't believe that it happened. When this came to Sweden that was the 1770s, I believe. One of the thing they did was to they must have done it like that. Put it down, face down, peel off the canvas. So we just have the crust of the painting layer, and then attach a new canvas. And that, apparently that technique was fairly new at the time, as far as I've understood. But that's a chance to take. And the restorer then added an extra sword there on top there. Yeah, I was a student of another student of Odd Nerdrum, who at the same time as I was a student, and he described Nerdrum's painting method, and obviously there are similarities here. As starting with a sketch, and then working a lot with it and really finishing it, and then superimposing a sketch at the end. And then you come back to these dark areas that suddenly come in and connect things and give things volume, separate them where they need to be separated. Yeah, and you see that sketch-like quality in this figure. And now you have to understand that it's not sketch-like to be sketch-like, but not being detailed, again, going up to that fundamental point of not taking attention from the most important thing. So it basically doesn't have an eye. The ear, well, that's not how you paint ears, right? But it's all about flattening the forms, but giving it vibrancy and not taking attention. But if you look at Rembrandt's early paintings, you see that you need to go through a very clear understanding of the form before you start doing something like that, because it's like this here. that shouldn't really work. Just a very round form like that, which very easily gives the impression that there's no solidity of the form. But again, Rembrandt can do those things. You know, he pulls it off. And it's probably this guy who's holding that sword, because that one there is holding the sword coming up here. So you can ask if the young Edvard Munch somehow saw this or similar things by Rembrandt. At least Nerdrum did, and that's a very interesting development. Painting in this manner as a very young man, both Nerdrum and Munch, but then Nerdrum goes through the Caravaggio school, which of course Rembrandt also did in some way, and then he comes back to this way of painting. And you have some small gems, like look at these, the thumb here, and then the pointing finger here. So you see that when there's clear indication of the direction of the light, or on the sleeve here of the man, suddenly when there's clear directions, he goes in and builds up the volume if the form and the light hitting it allows it. You see there, it's all about the gray, greens and the reds, all the complementary and temperature contrasts. And it's interesting that they gave the commission to this Govert Flink originally, and then he died, and Rembrandt came in late into this mix of 3-4 painters who got the commission. And you see some of these other things are very, very messy, very, very, every figure is talking equally the same, and so it's quite, it's a cacophony, it's a lot of people talking at the same time, but here you have that calm and leading up to the climax, even though of course there's not a lot of drama, physical action going on, but that highlights their centrality. I think that's one major lesson to take from Rembrandt. Calming down the forms, but they couldn't be flat in the wrong way, and directing the attention towards the most important things. And you have to know what those are. So this is maybe the last one he ever worked on. Apparently, they say it was left unfinished when he died in 1669. And I read somewhere someone's talking about how the female figure was added by a student or so. And in any case, it's one of those very strange, absolutely not naturalistic situations where there's sort of one body with two heads. But that's how you have to think as a painter. Right? You have to, same as Caravaggio does with the Conversion of Saul, where the horse has two human legs. Visually it appears like that, so that things are melted together. And It's so fantastic to see it again. It's a long time since I've seen it. And speaking of this quote-unquote flatness of Rembrandt, if you look at the whole, his arm, the whole body that we see, it's really quite monochrome. But again, you have the vibrancy of it, of the fabric, so it's not flat in the wrong way. And then you have that whole area here, and of course you have the beard hanging down, and then those white strokes here of the collar. And again, you can just test it. You can edit that out in Photoshop, and you see that things just flatten in the wrong way. Munch does the same in The Sick Child. It's just amazingly effective. And yeah, that's one thing I wanted to mention too, which is so strange. You wouldn't immediately think of Rembrandt as Greek, because Rembrandt, people are dressed up and they're sitting in front of the fireplace under quite a few layers of clothing. But he does things that are very much in the Greek way of thinking, and that quote-unquote flattening of forms to get one whole form is quintessentially Greek in the way of thinking. But there's another thing which is so fascinating, because I've always thought that so here you see the feet of the Christ child. This is Simon. He was promised that the last thing he would be able to experience holding Jesus Christ, the child, in his arms before he died. So this is what is depicted. So the Jesus child is lying there, and here you have the feet sticking out. And I always wondered what all of those things around, what's going on here, because it's so messy. And then when I finally realized this thing about how you can paint movement like Munch does in Self-Portrait with a Cigarette, the hand coming up, there's a stroke that sort of pushes it up, or like Nerdrum does in The Golden Cape with the reflection coming later than the actual foot, so there's an indication of movement, or in his painting Tourette. Then I understood that that's what Rembrandt is doing here. This is little baby Jesus kicking. He is moving his feet. As I say, you think about Rembrandt, people are seated in chairs, multiple layers of clothing. You don't think of him as active in that sense. I mean, like Titian, you think, okay, people are hunting and they're gesticulating and killing, whatever. But this is so much calmer. And you look at that the white stroke there, under the hand to the right. Suddenly there's one stroke that sort of saves the whole form. And if you ever want a perfect example of how things appear in your side vision, this is it. And obviously you need to know how the fingers look like, you need to know the form before you start dissolving like that, because if you don't, it just goes wrong. So a dissolved contour line, it's not separating the different fingers, and it's not separating the hand from the surroundings. Just a little place like there, some dark line under there to keep the form, over there to keep the form. But otherwise it's moving. And if you compare with generally the other Baroque painters here, how they paint hands, you see that they explain everything very clearly, and then it becomes quite noisy. And Rembrandt doesn't do that. It's in the side vision, and this sense of, if you have to understand where the boundaries of the form are is first, of course. But once you do that, once you know that, you can start to dissolve it, and then someday the fingers are not stiff. They can start moving. You see, it's full of it. You have the movement here, but also, so let's count here. All the strokes. You have the white collar, you have the little stroke coming here in the temple, of course on the nose, beside the mouth, and down there on Jesus, on the finger also. Look at that. You go really into the beard. Where does it end and where does the jacket start? I'll pay 50 cents to the person who can find a contour line around the beard, because you won't. And it's all this, almost the same value, just the greens against the brown red. And look at that eye. And look at the other eye, how it's so counterintuitive. It's, as I say, you go to Rembrandt to learn painting. That ear, that's actually the ear. You don't see it and then suddenly, what? Oh my God, that's an ear. Just pushes it down, pushes it back, and out of attention. So even the hands are in the side vision. That woman is not so present, regardless of who painted her. So Simon is the most important thing, because it's his promise being fulfilled here, and the sacrality of the moment. And so, okay, what shows that? Okay, pushes down the ear. Doesn't focus too much on the contour line of the beard, so that he's holding Jesus Christ. And then you see these two eyes. And then we come back to what I said, what is counterintuitive here is that, yeah, you come to Rembrandt to learn to paint, and then you see, you don't come to Rembrandt to learn to paint eyes, because you have to do that. You have to know that beforehand, and then you can come here and learn how to manipulate, pacify, emphasize, be a storyteller. And look how he just places these planes against each other. You have that, the nostril meeting the skin next to it, and it's all just grays against reds, or cool, warm contrast, and that is sufficient. Don't focus so much on getting that nostril clear, because it takes away from the eye. He knows that. Okay, so he tones it down. The eye becomes much more important. That's painterly, so beautiful. And you also see on the eye this idea of exaggerating the form, making it more geometric, because obviously it's not a square, but it is quite geometric, that shape of the light of the eyelid. And that, you could say, is anatomically wrong, but it gives that little shock that gives it volume. And then again, that one little, almost pure white of a stroke that makes the nose pop out. And you can do this with, you can also put this in some picture editing program. Take away that light stroke, the nose is suddenly too flat. Thank you for checking out this video from the School of Apelles. Go to caveofapelles.com/subscribe and access our premium library. That's caveofapelles.com/subscribe.